All right, let's get cooking. Welcome to the latest edition of Chin Check Sports Radio. I'm your host, JD. I want to thank you all for taking the time out to join us. And as always, we welcome any suggestions, feedback, comments, and criticisms, which improves the quality of our program, which ultimately improves your listening experience. Before we get started, we want to send you all our heartfelt thanks on your tremendous support, as well as your feedback. As we stated before, we created Chin Check Radio because we didn't agree with a lot of what the mainstream media, at least the mainstream sports media, talks about. This is something that we enjoy doing. This is a passion for us. This is a hobby for us. We're not trying to monetize or build a million YouTube subscribers. This is something that we enjoy talking about, and we simply want to share our experiences and our thoughts with the world. And the fact that you all take the time out to even listen to our program and our content and even enjoy our program and our content shows that we are doing something right, and we will only continue to bring you quality program as well as quality content. We want to continue on with our Chin Check Radio Reverie, our fantasy matchups, fights in professional boxing that never happened. Now, these things are something that transcends pretty much all professional sports. Guys get together, and now with the growing army of women now listening to or watching professional sports, we can include them in the discussion. But amongst guys, there's always a who would win between this era and this era. In this particular sport, who would be a better hitter, Barry Bonds or Babe Ruth? Who would be a better professional basketball player, LeBron James or Michael Jordan? Who would win between the 90s Cowboys and the 70s Steelers? So there's always those what-if questions, those mythical matchup questions, and of course, being that we also love professional boxing, we definitely wanted to create our own fantasy matchups. And we've got a lot of positive feedback for the matchups that we created already. People have already disagreed with the winners that we've chosen in those fantasy matchups, and that's okay. This matchup is going to be between two fighters who actually fought in the same era and they were in the same weight class. Oftentimes in fantasy matchups, you have fighters from two completely different eras, of course, who people generally follow. So usually it's Muhammad Ali of the 70s versus Mike Tyson of the 80s and the 90s. You have Sugar Ray Leonard of the late 70s and the 80s versus Floyd Mayweather today. You have the late marvelous Marvin Hagler of the late 70s and early 80s versus the Bernard Hopkins of the late 90s and all throughout the 2000s. So it's commonplace to talk from era to era, and we generally pick our fantasy matchups from fighters that we actually grew up watching. Now, even though we do have an extensive fight collection that's all on VHS, yes, we still have VHS, and it's something that I can go back and watch and analyze and critique fighters of yesteryear. But it's a little bit different because being that I wasn't in that time frame, not really aware of the politics that was going on. And yes, even though I can watch a fight and analyze it and really break it down, but being alive at that time, you kind of know the backstory and live the backstory in order to really analyze this fight and all the things that went into it. Because of course, as time goes on, certain memories fade and you're kind of left with what you're told or left with what you see. But often if you're around that era, you can maybe have a little bit of backstory as to how we got to a certain point. So this matchup is going to be between the Golden Boy, Oscar De La Hoya, versus the late Vernon the Viper Forrest. And this is something that we choose these fighters in these fantasy matchups, fighters that we respect, fighters that we admire. And like we've always said, the reason why we love boxing and we keep these guys' names alive because they entertain us for years. They put their bodies on the line, literally their bodies and their health on the line, and really their lives on the line to entertain us. And we feel that, you know, after the glory years are done, they're often forgotten about, and we definitely don't want their memories to fade. So this is among the reasons why we do these fantasy matchups, to bring these fighters to you. And we've noticed that when we talk about certain fighters, and especially a lot of people know your mainstream fighters, but when we talk about some of these boxers, people are like, wow, I didn't know about this person. I didn't know that he was that good. So we're definitely proud of that. So this matchup is going to be pick anywhere between the 147 division, the welterweight division, or 154 pounds, the light middleweight division, between Oscar De La Hoya and Vernon Forrest. Now let's get into the career of Oscar De La Hoya. It's going to be a lot, ladies and gentlemen, so bear with us. We've already done our Oscar De La Hoya on our fighters, our greatest fighters of all time, made the honorable mention list. So some notable fights in his career: March of 1993, a TKO in the 4th round versus the uncle of Floyd Mayweather and the brother of Floyd Sr., as well as the late Roger Mayweather. He defeated Jeff Mayweather in a TKO in the 4th round. In July 1994, a KO in the 2nd round versus Jorge Paez. Now let's also backtrack. Everybody knows Oscar De La Hoya was the golden boy. He won the gold medal at the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona, Spain. He famously stood on the podium, crying after playing of the national anthem, thinking of his mom who had recently deceased of cancer. So definitely De La Hoya had a lot of fanfare behind him, much like Sugar Ray Leonard did 16 years prior in the 1976 Olympics. So definitely, especially at that time in boxing, you were still respected being a top amateur, especially a gold medalist. You definitely had a lot of fanfare behind you. Not so much recently, but especially at that time of the 70s, the 80s, and even the 90s, you could tell that De La Hoya was really the last big Olympic star that eventually made his way into the professional ranks. So just kind of keep that in mind. February of 1995, a unanimous decision over John Molina. A TKO victory in the 2nd round versus Rafael Ruelas, May of 1995, winning the IBF lightweight title. In September of 1995, a stoppage in the 6th round versus Gennaro Hernandez. December of 1995, a referee stoppage against Jesse James Leija. First big battle that really put De La Hoya on the map, especially in terms of Mexican fans. Which is ironic. De La Hoya wasn't really appreciated by a lot of Mexican fans because, again, you still had that ghost of one Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. around. So he's still, Chavez, again, with the long undefeated record and everything from Culiacan, Mexico. So definitely Chavez, and even to this day, he still is Mexico's most famous and greatest boxer. But especially at that time when Chavez was still active, you have De La Hoya coming up, who really wasn't seen as a pure Mexican, but defeated Chavez June of 1996, and older Chavez, a TKO in the 4th round. A unanimous decision April 1997 against the late Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, in a fight that I thought and a lot of other people thought that De La Hoya never won that fight. This is again facing an older Whitaker, but I thought Whitaker did enough to win that fight. September of 1997, a unanimous decision over the late Hector Macho Camacho. In December of 1997, a TKO in the 8th round versus Wilfredo Rivera. In September of 1998, a referee stoppage again in a rematch against Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. A classic fight, folks. Let me say this again. A classic fight. February 1999, a split decision against Ike Bazooka Cuarte. Folks, that is definitely the fight that I thought a lot of people gave Oscar De La Hoya a lot of respect. Fighting Ike Cuarte from Accra, Ghana, had a piston-like jab. His best punch was his jab. Control the pace of the jab. If you go back and look at that 6th round, that's one of the greatest rounds in welterweight boxing history, where you have De La Hoya who gets a knockdown of Cuarte. Cuarte then goes back, scores a knockdown right back against De La Hoya. So now the fight was even. You saw some rounds where Cuarte was creating the impression he was dominating Oscar De La Hoya. In the 12th round, De La Hoya gets another knockdown, and the referee is close to stopping the fight. Ike Cuarte is just swinging against the ropes. He was defending himself, so he understood that final round. And folks, one of the all-time great welterweight fights. And I think, believe it or not, that fight gets actually overlooked in terms of all-time great welterweight fights. I think that fight is often underlooked as one of De La Hoya's greatest battles, but definitely a great fight. And again, me personally, I don't think De La Hoya won that fight, but again, he got the fight by split decision. May of 1999, a TKO in the 11th round against Obakar. September of 1999, his first professional loss against Felix Tito Trinidad. Ladies and gentlemen, to really put that fight into perspective, that fight was seen as the next great welterweight fight. I believe it was called the fight of the millennium. Understand this. Remember how big Thomas Hearns and Sugar Ray Leonard was back in 80, 81? this fight was seen along those lines. There was also a changing in the guard where you have a lot of Latin fighters or Hispanic fighters who were definitely making their name on the boxing scene. They were the welterweights, and welterweights are usually seen as the glamour division. You can maybe figure heavyweights are the most popular. You have your middleweights, but it's something about your welterweight division that's always special. And a lot of fanfare. Go back and look at that legendary fight series that HBO did about this fight. You had the whole issue with what's going on in Puerto Rico on the island of Yaques with military testing. So a lot went into this fight. And of course you have the Puerto Rico versus Mexican boxing rivalry. And for us hardcore fight fans, you know when there's a fight between a Mexican and a Puerto Rican, it gets people going. And this is me coming from Newark, New Jersey, the New York, New Jersey area. And it's something that, of course, on the East Coast is heavily dominated with Puerto Ricans versus on the West Coast, you have like a lot of your Mexicans. So that definitely builds a lot of emotion. And Felix Trinidad won a majority decision against De La Hoya, which I don't think that Tito won that fight. If anything, the more I watch that fight, the more I give the early rounds to De La Hoya. If anything, De La Hoya was giving Tito a boxing lesson. Felix, I know you're listening. I don't mean Felix Trinidad. I mean my good buddy Felix back in New Jersey. I know he listened to this broadcast. And you're probably going to text me saying, or after you listen to this broadcast, telling me that you thought that Trinidad won the fight, when in fact he did. So, but again, officially, it was a victory for Felix Trinidad. And go back and watch that series and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. June of 2000, in another classic fight, his second professional loss against Sugar Shane Mosley. Folks, another great fight they were out in LA. Shane Mosley versus De La Hoya came up together through the amateur ranks. They were always great friends. Another great classic fight. De La Hoya started to wear down at the end a little bit in that fight. But I think that was Shane Mosley's coming out party. I definitely remember watching those fights along with other fights at my boy Julio's house. Julio, I know you're listening. You remember when we watched it with Pops? I mean, Pops, rest in peace. March of 2001, a TKO victory in the 5th round against the late Arturo Gatti. June of 2001, a unanimous decision against Javier Castillejo. In September of 2002, the grudge match versus one Fernando Vargas. Now again, this goes back to what I said about De La Hoya not really being respected by or really appreciated during his heyday by Mexican fans. The reason why I say that, booed heavily when he fought Julio Cesar Chavez. Now part of that is the myth, the ghost of Chavez, the larger-than-life persona in Mexico that Chavez had. Fernando Vargas, young upstart, not really a boxer, more of a slugger, while De La Hoya was always seen as a pretty boxer. And the old story goes is that when Vargas, and there was seen to be some manufactured hatred in this fight, the old story goes is that one day a young Vargas was doing his road work out on the West Coast, I'm going to say Big Bear, California, somehow fell in a snowbank or fell when he running. De La Hoya runs by, laughs at him, and for some reason that sparked the whole hatred that Fernando Vargas had of Oscar De La Hoya, and that pretty much was the basis of that fight. Now, amongst fight fans, there was your head goes with De La Hoya, your heart went with Vargas, because De La Hoya was a more seasoned fighter, had the better chin, the better boxing ability, actually had a better corner with Floyd Mayweather Sr. versus Vargas. There were some questions whether he was still the same after his brutal beating at the hands of the aforementioned Felix Trinidad. So it's always questioned if Vargas was the same fighter. And going into that fight, when Vargas took off his shirt, this guy was ripped up, muscular. I mean, at the weigh-in, this dude was ripped up, muscular, and it was a tale of two fights. You had De La Hoya controlling the action in the middle of the ring, while Vargas' job was to cut the ring off and pretty much press the action against the ropes. I thought De La Hoya, in terms of a complete fight, fought a complete fight versus Fernando Vargas, where Floyd Mayweather Sr. was giving him instructions where as soon as he finished up with his combinations, go back to his jab. And as De La Hoya kept landing his jab, started snapping Vargas' head back, taking the steam off of Vargas' punches, and gets a TKO in the 11th round. What's funny about that fight, Vargas, because he was so ripped and cut and shredded, he tested positive for steroids. So we know why he was ripped up in that fight. And so De La Hoya beat up a roided fighter in that fight that I thought it was his most complete performance. May of 2003, a TKO in the 7th round versus Yuri Boy Campus. September of 2003, a unanimous decision loss against Sugar Shane Mosley in the rematch. Everybody watching that fight knows that De La Hoya won that fight, no questions asked. I never forget when I was watching the fight with Julio and all the other guys at my old job in Fortunoff. I remember when the decision was made and they said, and the new, and I remember I sat up from my chair and I said, what? And you had the look, even Shane Mosley had a look of shock on his face that even he didn't think he won that fight. And of course, that was a horrible decision. De La Hoya clearly won that fight. We all know, and again, at that time, Shane Mosley was not really the same fighter after suffering 2 losses against, and we're going to talk about his career, against the late Vernon Forrest. So that was a way of De La Hoya getting his win back. And again, they fought at junior middleweight at 154, not at welterweight like they did 3 years prior. But that set him up to move up to the middleweight division, where he took on 160-pound champion Felix Sturm. And that's in June of 2004. Now, Oscar De La Hoya came out, threw 100 punches in that first round against Felix Sturm, and at that point, he had nothing else. He looked out of shape. He looked pudgy. He clearly was not a welterweight, or didn't really build himself up to be a welterweight. So, and I thought Felix Sturm clearly won that fight. So I found it funny at that time. A lot of De La Hoya fans were breathing hot fire and they were cursing me out and they were upset about the Shane Mosley fight. Months later, when there's an offer decision in De La Hoya's favor, and we know the reason why that fight was given to De La Hoya, because the judges in Vegas, and again, I'm not a conspiracy theory guy, but every now and again I do put on my tinfoil baseball cap. They knew that if Sturm was to be given that decision, $1 million pay-per-view fight that eventually grossed $1 million pay-per-view buys versus Bernard Hopkins would have been flushed down the tube. So that's why they gave Hoya that victory, and they gave the fight to him winning the WBO middleweight championship. September of 2004, KO victory in the 9th. A KO loss in the 9th round versus the aforementioned Bernard Hopkins due to a beautiful body shot that really caught him right underneath the rib cage, dropped him, and that was Oscar De La Hoya's first ever knockout loss. So that says a lot. May of 2006, a TKO victory in the 6th round versus Ricardo El Matador Mayorga. Fight named Danger Zone because of the potential danger that Mayorga has. We're going to talk about him in a little bit. A year later, May of 2007, a split decision loss against Floyd Mayweather Jr. Now, this was really Floyd Mayweather's coming out party, even though Floyd was known amongst most hardcore fight fans, but this is the fight that really put him on the mainstream, and that Money Mayweather character that everybody knows, loves, and in more cases hates, it was born from that fight. May of 2008, unanimous decision victory against Steve Forbes, which was funny. He was trained by the aforementioned Jeff Mayweather. And his final fight, December of 2008, a thrashing against one Manny Pacquiao. Now again, hardcore fight fans knew about Manny Pacquiao. That's a fight that really put Pacquiao on the map for casual or the mainstream fight fans, beating up Oscar De La Hoya, and that's really the fight that really started the talk of matching Pacquiao versus a Floyd Mayweather. So De La Hoya definitely had an impressive career, as we discussed before. We're talking a man with 45 total fights, 39 wins, 30 KOs, and 6 losses. His fantasy matchup is going to be one Vernon Forrest, who stood at 6 feet tall with a 73-inch reach. Total of 45 fights, 41 wins, 29 wins by knockout, 3 losses, and 1 no contest. Now, some notable fights in the career of Vernon Forrest. November of 1997, a unanimous decision victory against Ray Oliveira. March of 1998, a TKO in the 2nd round versus Gilberto Flores. August of 1998, a TKO in the 11th round against Adrian Stone. January of 2000, a unanimous decision victory against former titleist Vince Phillips. Vince Phillips won his first title by knocking out the the former unified 140-pound champion Costa Tzu. So that's when Vince Phillips won his first title, was beating Costa Tzu. August of 2000, a no contest versus Raul Frank. May of 2001, a unanimous decision victory in the rematch against Raul Frank. Now here's where Vernon Forrest got on the radar of boxing fans. January of 2002, Madison Square Garden, a unanimous decision victory over Sugar Shane Mosley. Now here's why I say it's good to analyze these fights from the era that you watched them in. Because at that time, when Vernon Forrest fought Shane Mosley was pretty much 3 straight fights off of his epic victory against Oscar De La Hoya in June of 2000. He fights 3-0 fights, then fights Vernon Forrest. Now, why Vernon Forrest was even a name? Because Vernon Forrest beat Shane Mosley when they were amateurs. So now, even though oftentimes amateur success does not equate or translate into professional success, because that's 2 different styles of boxing. But there was always a talk of Shane Mosley, he was undefeated, was really destined for welterweight greatness. That De La Hoya fight really put him on the map. I personally think what hurt Shane was pretty much fighting 3-0 fights, including the aforementioned Adrian Stone, beating him in 3 rounds. And a lot of that momentum I felt was lost, because you figure at that time you had Felix Trinidad, you had Vernon Forrest, you could have had a rematch with De La Hoya, you had the Fernando Vargases. A deep, rich welterweight class. And since Sugar Shane Mosley, well, the name Sugar was his moniker, a lot of people felt he wasn't all that different from Sugar Ray Leonard. And I give Shane Mosley credit, he didn't take a backseat to anybody. But fighting those 3-0 fights really didn't do him any favors. Fights Vernon Forrest, a man who beat him as an amateur, and of course Mosley wanting to exercise that demon or exercise that ghost, was in for a rude awakening. I thought Shane Mosley won the first round. In the second round, now HBO commentator George Foreman says that Shane Mosley did not look warmed up properly in that fight. Come out pretty dry, no sweat, because you always see a fighter have some type of little light sweat going, kind of hitting the pads. Even myself being a competitor, I generally like to warm up. You don't want to just go in there because you're not warmed up, you don't have your timing yet, you don't want to pull a muscle and stuff like that. So I understand exactly what George Foreman was talking about. In the second round, for some reason, I don't know if Shane Mosley tried to switch from southpaw and then tried to switch back to orthodox, but it seemed like his feet kind of got crisscrossed, left his left hand down, and Vernon Forrest came over the top and cracked him with an overhand right. So Mosley at this point is clearly stunned. He's buzzed by the right hand. At this point, Forrest is throwing everything to land. He's really not landing anything. Gets Shane Mosley trapped against the ropes, unloads a left hook that Mosley blocks, that gets his attention from the left hook. He leaves himself open. Vernon Forrest lands a blistering uppercut that literally knocked his head up and pretty much led right into a 1-2 that Mosley ate all 3 of those punches consecutively. It was actually a brutal knockdown, quite frankly. Again, cracks him with the overhand right. Know he has Mosley stunned. Mosley's kind of reeling around the ring, chases him across the ring, traps him against the ropes, throws a left hook that distracts Mosley, comes up with an uppercut, a perfect uppercut right between the guard, lifts Mosley's chin up and actually stiffens him up, and then drops a 1-2 right in Mosley's face, and that's the first official knockdown of Shane Mosley's career. Now, what Shane Mosley fans will tell you, preceding that action, when Mosley got a little bit more aggressive, there was an accidental clashing of heads, which is what Vernon Forrest did in the Raul Frank fight. An accidental clash of heads, and folks, is boxing, it happens. An accidental clash of heads was the first time that Mosley really had blood on him. Clearly, it was a blood kind of in the crown of the hairline, or the crown of the head, kind of right in the hairline, a trickle of blood. You can tell Mosley was kind of bothered by that. That took him out of the game. I don't think he was hurt by that, even though the excuse after the fight was that he might have been hurt by that. He might have been buzzed by the headbutt, which left him open for the punches. I don't think that's what it was, because he got more aggressive afterwards, and he paid the price dearly, and he got caught. So First knockdown, Mosley's hurt. First knockdown of his career. I'm sitting here stunned at this point watching this fight. I'm truly stunned because nobody's expecting this. So now at this point, Mosley gets up, floundering around the ring. He's trying to hold on, using every piece of professionalism that he has. He's holding on for dear life. Vernon Forrest is trying to throw everything, and Forrest catches him with another right hand. Again, Mosley's legs, they're just not there. His legs are just like spaghetti. They're like jelly. No balance, no stability. Equilibrium is all over the place. And scores another knockdown, which he wasn't knocked down, but it was a off-balance shot caused by a punch, and at this point Mosley was still on Dream Street. So 2 official knockdowns in the second round, and pretty much it was all Vernon Forrest for the rest of the fight. Mosley tried to have his moments, but he really could not overcome the overhand right of one Vernon Forrest. He really couldn't overcome the uppercut, and every now and again when Forrest unloaded the right hand, it definitely got Shane Mosley's attention. So now Vernon Forrest, out of nowhere, kind of seen as the odd man out. Again, it's the welterweight division with De La Hoya, with Fernando Vargas, with Felix Trinidad. The odd man out has just now beaten the #1 guy in this division. Now, this is after the Bernard Hopkins fight, so this is the welterweight fight. Really the welterweight era of Shane Mosley. Again, Shane Mosley is seen as the big star in boxing, or potential big star in boxing. And here comes old nemesis from the Olympics, is Vernon Forrest beating Shane Mosley. Something interesting that Vernon Forrest said before they made that fight was, at the time they were coming up through the ranks, Shane Mosley was always destined for greatness. He was given his #1 ranking, while Vernon Forrest says, I had to fight for my #1 ranking. So while I had to fight for my ranking, they just gave it to Shane. So coming out of nowhere, Vernon Forrest is the brand new WBC and ring welterweight champion of the world by a great fight, a dominating performance over the previously undefeated Sugar Shane Mosley. They fought a rematch in July of 2002. Shane Mosley comes out. I remember having a bet with one of my good buddies when I used to work at a World's Gym. And Shane Mosley comes out, first 2 seconds, lands a cracking right hand that gets Vernon Forrest's attention. After that initial offense, Mosley pretty much did nothing. Again, more of the same action, controlling the pace with his jab, the overhand right, the uppercut. And I felt clearly won a unanimous decision. So in 2 consecutive fights, Vernon Forrest has defeated Shane Mosley pretty easily, by the way. And let's face it, these weren't any split decision fights. These weren't rounds that could have went either way or tough rounds to score. These were dominating decisions by Vernon Forrest against Shane Mosley. Now you can say styles make fights, and that's how boxing is sometimes. Styles do make fights. One guy can just have your number. Remember, the late Ken Norton always had the late Muhammad Ali's number. So it happens, but let's call it for what it is. Vernon Forrest pretty much coming out of nowhere just beat, at that time, the recognized best welterweight the best welterweight in the world pretty easily. So that says something right there. Afterwards, Vernon Forrest signs a 6-fight contract with HBO. Now, something interesting when that contract was signed. Vernon Forrest was seen, because of his height and long reach, was seen as the new era, or the modern day version for that time, of one Thomas Hitman Hearns. So a lot of big things were expected from Vernon Forrest. Again, he has now taken over as a top welterweight in the world. Fights a little-known guy by the name of Ricardo El Matador Mayorga, January of 2003. Now, Vernon Forrest came out rapping, literally standing in the aisleway, rapping. Probably, I don't know if he didn't take Mayorga seriously, didn't know what he was getting himself into. Mayorga being a brawler, technically flawed, but extremely powerful and a pure brawler, decides to fight Mayorga's fight, and clearly is TKO'd in 3 rounds. Actually, there was a knockdown in the first round of that fight. Could be a little question, but there was a knockdown in the first round of that fight. Forrest came back, trying to fight his fight, and is caught trading punches with Mayorga. And Ricardo Mayorga has now become the best welterweight in the world. Take that for what it's worth, ladies and gentlemen. So Vernon Forrest, after defeating Shane Mosley twice, the best welterweight in the world, himself becoming the best welterweight in the world, in his first fight after signing a 6-fight deal with the network HBO, loses in his first fight against Ricardo Mayorga, wild man and all. A shocker. Another shocker. This is why I miss HBO. Another shocker. July of 2003, and another decision loss against Ricardo Mayorga. Now, when you go back and you watch that fight, there's always questions, and I remember Max Kellerman saying that he always thought that Vernon Forrest won the fight. Now, what's interesting when you go back and you watch that fight is that Mayorga really, in terms of actual punches landed, he created more of an impression that he was dominating Vernon Forrest. Where I always said that Vernon Forrest had a very solid corner with Ronnie Shields and Al Mitchell. Very solid corner, pretty much telling him the right advice. And I'm talking where even in the first fight, when they were telling him, why are you training with him, box with him, they told him the same thing in the second fight. Take your time, all you need to do is jab, and just box this man. But there were parts in that fight, because of Mayorga's power, or maybe Vernon Forrest being wary of Mayorga's power, there were punches that Mayorga was landing clearly on the glove that really did not connect, that was literally knocking Forrest across the ring. That creates an impression. There were times where clearly during those middle stages from the 6th, 7th, maybe to the 8th or 9th round, where Ricardo Mayorga did nothing. Clearly him smoking cigarettes would give me an illusion that he's smoking cigarettes. Clearly his conditioning and cardio wasn't there for those 7th, 8th, 9th rounds where Forrest really started to gain ground. I thought Forrest won the first round. You go based through the 2nd through the 5th and the 6th. I would say the 2nd through the 5th. Not because of what really Mayorga did. It was more because he just created the impression, being the effective aggressor, throwing the punches, knocking Forrest across the ring. Even the punches didn't land, but it creates an impression on judges. I think people forget, as much as we criticize officiating, and I'm not saying that they are without criticism, but they are human. And myself, when I was living in my home state, New Jersey, I actually trained to become a boxing judge. I took training in that. So I understand when you're at ringside and you're watching the fight and the action is heavy, you have to make decisions. So I totally understand where judges are coming from. So when you are judging the fight and you see a fighter throwing punches, knocking another fighter across the ring, it creates an impression that you're beating that fighter. So that's why I can see why there is discussion or debate if Mayorga won the rematch or Forrest won the rematch. So definitely a good rematch, but it goes down after beating Shane Mosley twice, has now suffered 2 straight losses to Ricardo Mayorga. Through injuries or whatever reason, he takes 2 years off, fights in July of 2005, a TKO in the second round against Sergio Rios. August of 2006, a unanimous decision victory against Ike Bazooka Quartey. Go back and watch that fight. Clearly, Vernon Forrest, he did not win that fight. Ike Quartey clearly got robbed in that fight, and I felt bad for Quartey because even when the winner was announced, you saw Quartey looking at the judges with his hands out to the side, shocked, like, kind of giving the motion. What were you all watching? And I remember I was working out at my old gym back home, and I remember there's a cool brother I knew. He was one of them guys that you know by face, and we're talking about the fight. He tells me, he goes, JD, I was home, like my wife took the kids and they were out, and I figured, I had the whole night to myself. I'm going to sit back, I'm going to drink my little bottle of Hennessy and just enjoy the fight. He goes, when they announced that Vernon Forrest won the fight, I literally had to look. I looked at my bottle of Hennessy to make sure that it wasn't anything in the Hennessy that I didn't see what I just saw. So that's kind of a little joke I did remember a long time ago having that conversation. July of 2007, a unanimous decision victory against Carlos Baldomir. December of 2007, a TKO in the 11th round against Michelle Picarillo. June of 2008, a majority decision loss against the contender winner, Sergio Mora. And September of 2008, in his final professional fight, a unanimous decision victory against Sergio Mora in the rematch. So again, De La Hoya's last professional fight was December of 2008. Forrest's last professional fight was September of 2008. And unfortunately, Vernon Forrest was murdered in Atlanta, Georgia, July 25th, 2009. And the people who committed this despicable crime are now serving life sentences. So thank God for that. But as I stated, Forrest and De La Hoya were around the same weight class at the same time. So it does make you wonder why they never fought. And I understand why, because each man had, their own business, to tend to. While De La Hoya was a big star, Mosley was coming to be a big star, especially making his name in the lightweight division. Forrest was a junior welterweight, eventually moving up to welterweight. So this one of those they just never fought. But that, I felt at that time, if they would have fought, definitely would have been a good matchup. Now, let's go into our Chin Check Radio. How would this fight play out in the ring? Now let's break down all these guys. In terms of corner, De La Hoya has always gone through corner men like people change socks. It wasn't Gil Clancy, Roberto Alcazar. At one time he tried to main with Stewart. I always felt his Freddie Roach later on in his career. I've always felt when Oscar De La Hoya was actually at his best was when he was with Floyd Mayweather Sr. You could tell Floyd Mayweather Sr. was actually teaching him a lot of the shoulder roll technique. Of course, it wasn't executed like Floyd Mayweather Jr. or Money Mayweather, but I felt it was serviceable. It worked what needed to work. His jab, De La Hoya had an excellent jab when he used it, a solid hook, and say what you want of De La Hoya, a great chin, and didn't take a backseat to anybody. Again, we're only talking 2 career losses, and a career loss is pretty much a body shot against a natural welterweight and getting beat up as an older fighter against one Manny Pacquiao. So a great chin. Vernon Forrest has the height. Reach is the same, ironically. 7'3" reach on both men. Now you can say Vernon Forrest in terms of chin being knocked out by Mayorga. Okay, less chin, but I felt had a solid jab, and is definitely by Ronnie Shields, which goes to his corner. Ronnie Shields and Al Mitchell, stalwarts in his corner, especially during his heyday. So no questions about that. Vernon Forrest definitely had a solid jab, had a solid uppercut, a good right hand. So those were his strengths. Oscar De La Hoya threw much more combinations, while Forrest was more of your basic 1-2 punch. He was more of your 1-2 fighter, and he did the 1-2s very well along with excellent uppercut. De La Hoya had a little bit faster hands. Hand speed was greater. Definitely De La Hoya took a page out of the Sugar Shane Mosley book. The Sugar Ray Leonard book of shoe shining, pitter-patching, trying to steal rounds. So definitely would have been an interesting fight. Again, strengths and weaknesses. De La Hoya was given decisions that I don't feel he really wanted. There was always questions about De La Hoya's stamina in certain fights. I believe you really saw that in the Shane Mosley fight. And again, this is him fighting at welterweight. So always questions about his stamina. Now, of course, moving up in weight, he wasn't really physically the same fighter that he was. So his best weights were at welterweight and junior middleweight. Forrest, same thing. Forrest, great conditioning, great cardio. Again, this is going 12 hard rounds against Shane Mosley, another 12 hard rounds against Ricardo Mayorga in the second fight. So in terms of punching power, I would give the slight edge, and that's really a slight edge, to Oscar De La Hoya because he does have the knockouts on his resume. So I'm going to give a slight edge to punching power to De La Hoya. I'm going to give the chin to De La Hoya. I'm going to give the greater jab to Vernon Forrest. I'm going to give the uppercut to Vernon Forrest. I'm actually going to give the corner to Vernon Forrest. I think De La Hoya had faster hands. So it definitely would have been an interesting fight. And picking the winners of this fight, it would have been, I can see a split decision going in favor of Oscar De La Hoya. And solely because De La Hoya was a much more popular fighter. Again, giving a lot of gift decisions. Again, this is nothing bad against him. This is just what I saw watching Oscar De La Hoya growing up. Giving a lot of gift decisions, especially that fight probably would have been in Las Vegas. So Chin Check Radio, we're going to pick Oscar De La Hoya by a split decision. Forrest is going to win his rounds. Ronnie Shields is going to tell him to make the adjustments to jab to keep him at bay. And yes, and even though I do give the hand speed a slight edge to Oscar De La Hoya, and that's more so a flurrying and throwing punches and bunches, but Vernon Forrest had deceptively fast hands, hence the nickname the Viper. And again, if you talk common opponents, De La Hoya loses to Sugar Shane Mosley. Vernon Forrest beats Shane Mosley. So can you say A plus B equals C? Yeah, but in boxing, that's not always the case. So that's a common opponent. You take the Ricardo Mayorga. Now, when Mayorga fought Forrest, clearly Mayorga was younger, in shape, even though it's really 4 years later, but it's an older Mayorga. This is Mayorga who was beaten up by Felix Trinidad in 2004. So by the time he fought De La Hoya, he really wasn't the same fighter. Let's go to Ike Quartey. I think Ike Quartey won the fight against Ade La Hoya, and I also think he won the fight against Vernon Forrest. So it's really hard to gauge. So if you look at their common opponents, it's really hard to gauge how the fight play out based on their common opponents. So 2 guys in the ring, I expect a tough fight, hard rounds to score, but just based on judging, I would pick Oscar De La Hoya in our Chin Check Radio fantasy matchup in a split decision against the late Vernon Forrest. And to Vernon Forrest, brother, you rest in peace, and we're glad and we're honored to keep your name out there, to talk about your career, and to talk about all your ring accomplishments. And until the next time, this Chin Check Radio signing out.